Welcome to this live session on Substack on leading across difference. I'm Steve Walker. I'm a life and leadership coach. And I wanted to do this topic today, this theme, because it's so obvious, right? I've got this series that I'm doing here on Substack on leadership and integrity. And we are in a place where I think so many of us are frustrated by the lack of integrity in our leadership and in our society in so many ways and at so many levels. And so in some ways, this has been an important one for me to tackle. And it's going to be a hard one, I think, for a lot of people to listen to well and hear well, because I think we are so polarized. And I think we're in our own echo chambers. And I think it's really hard not to demonize the other side, no matter which side you're on. And I think, I have my own biases, and I certainly believe that there are really important values at stake right now. And that I've always been someone who had a very clear sense of what's right and wrong. So I clearly have my own sense of what's right and what's wrong and who's right and who's wrong. But real integrity means we have to be able to listen to each other, try to understand each other, and not just to try to convince each other that we're right and they're wrong, but to hopefully have some empathy to understand what is underlying a lot of the differences, and to find common ground, and not a lowest common denominator, but a highest common denominator, right? I think that's what we tend to focus on too often, is how do we find a lowest common denominator? What's the least amount of, the lowest value that we can all agree on. And that is minimizing the potential, I think, for where we could head as a society. And I think this is true within organizations, within companies as well, that we tend to dig in our heels. We tend to believe we're right, the other person is wrong. We tend to enter into arguments as if they are a zero-sum game where there has to be a winner and a loser, and we want to be the winner and make the other person a loser. And I think we've got to think differently. And that doesn't mean sacrificing our integrity or our values or our morals, as I'll get into. But it does mean making sure that we're engaging in these conversations and in these disagreements with integrity, right? And intellectual honesty. And I think that's really important, right? So I don't think that increased polarization has to be inevitable. It may feel like it right now. It does to me at times. But I think really what we're struggling with is a crisis of integrity, and I think dealing with that is the way forward, right? And you can have people who can be ideological opponents come together. And I want to share some stories from back when I was an activist back in the 1990s. And Marshall Harris and I were running essentially the Save Bosnia campaign. There was a couple of different organizations that we were running, but it was all under the same umbrella. And we got up and running in 1994, early 94, January, February 94. And we were trying to change the US policy on Bosnia, where there was a genocide at the time. And for us, it was pretty clear. There was a good guys and bad guys, right? There was the victims, the Bosnians, and the perpetrators, Serbia and its proxies in Bosnia. And we believed that the United States was complicit in that genocide. We were enforcing what we believed was an illegal arms embargo on Bosnia, denying them the right and the ability to defend themselves. And we believed that we had a legal and a moral obligation to let them defend themselves. And we would argue until they could, to help protect innocent civilians through airstrikes that we believe NATO should carry out. And we believed that war criminals should be punished. Like, who would have thought? And we, assembled an executive committee to advise us and help us with setting the course for the organization. And it was made up of some of the, heaviest hitters in American foreign policy of that generation. Some of whom were ideological enemies to that point. And a steering committee that eventually included, I think, 70 or 80 some odd people that, again, was across the political spectrum, and included human rights activists, neoconservative, policy experts and former cabinet officials, Nobel Prize winners, Elie Wiesel, people like Susan Sontag, Carl Sagan. I mean, it was all over the map, right? But I want to start off with a story about our executive committee. And at various points, our executive committee included initially George Soros, who funded us the first 9 to 12 months that we were operating. Aria Nair, who was a legend in the human rights arena and was the head of the Soros Foundations at that point. Morta Abramowitz, an esteemed, highly respected ambassador, at the time president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Max Kampelman, who was a legendary diplomat and negotiator who negotiated the Helsinki Accords, which established a framework for human rights in Europe and elsewhere. Hodding Carter, who had been the State Department press spokesperson under Jimmy Carter. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who most famously was my professor at Columbia University, but also was known for being the national security advisor under President Carter, and certainly was one of my heroes. And Frank Carlucci, who had been defense secretary. And so these are heavy hitters. And I remember the first time we gathered the executive committee together, and Aria Nair and Jeane Kirkpatrick were there. And Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was on our committee, had been Reagan's UN ambassador. And, definitely hardcore, right-wing, kind of neoconservative. I don't know if she would have agreed with that label, but certainly, I guess, of that ilk. Incredibly impressive, brilliant person. But the ideological opponent for decades at that point of Aria Nair, the human rights champion, right? Jeane was defending U.S. interventions in Central America and elsewhere. And, Aria was, raising the alarm against what was happening there. And, I remember them laughing, that like, oh my gosh, like, that we had brought together people who couldn't be in the same room together otherwise. And here they were. And it was because, these weren't people who were there because they were compromising on their convictions or their values or their worldviews, or splitting the difference or finding the lowest common denominator. They were trying to find the highest common denominator. They were trying to say, well, how far can we go together? Right? Think about that for a minute compared to the way we are right now, right? And they sat in the same room. They listened to each other respectfully, thoughtfully, with genuine intellectual honesty and curiosity, right? And through that, we're able to find common ground, right? It was so impressive to me. They didn't abandon their ideologies to do that. Quite the opposite. They found the place where maybe some of their values actually intersected, or where their values were in parallel to each other and led to the same conclusion, right? So I might see things this way, and these might be the values that I'm, supporting and protecting. These might be yours, right? We see things very differently, but we both agree that this is the direction we should head, right? Amazing, right? To find that common direction together. Again, not a compromise, but a highest common denominator, right? Trying to see how far we can go together. Not like how low do we need to lower our expectations and what we're willing to do till we both feel really comfortable with it. No, it was like, how far can we push ourselves so that we still feel like we're acting with integrity and consistent with our own values and beliefs, but doing something that could be meaningful and make a difference, right? So if you want to think about like, Aria, the human rights activist, and Jean, the realist, I think maybe the best way to describe her was really like, kind of a conservative realist foreign policy, brilliant person. Where could they converge, right? And Marshall, my job was to kind of help the executive committee do that when there were moments of either disagreement or where we needed to forge a new response to something that had happened on the ground, or a new response to a policy shift on the Clinton administration. Our job was to carve together statements, letters to the president, press conferences, congressional testimony, whatever, op-eds in the Washington Post or the New York Times or elsewhere that they could agree on, right? And to find the highest common denominator there. And that's part of it too, right? Is that intellectual honesty isn't just about hearing each other and taking into account each other's perspectives, even when you're diametrically opposed in so many ways to how you see the world and the US role in it. But to do so with the shared goal and committed to the shared goal of going as far as you can, with both of you feeling like you're not compromising your integrity, right? That's amazing. And our job was obviously to be a truly honest broker. And even though we clearly had our perspective, and Marshall and I generally saw eye to eye, all the time on policy, and what we were recommending. And but we had established our reputations for integrity because we'd quit publicly to protest U.S. policy toward Bosnia, right? We'd quit the State Department, the Foreign Service publicly. And so that established our integrity credentials. But day to day, we had to, protect that integrity in how we ran the organization and in how we dealt with these incredibly impressive, brilliant people who could be very passionate people, right, about what they believed in. But we couldn't be seen as trying to manipulate them. We had to be very upfront, transparent, respectful, and trying to help them reach agreement when they needed to as well, right? That trust was important, right, and vital. So, I think that's the first story I wanted to share from that time, because I think it's so illustrative of how people with big reputations, a lot on the line in terms of their reputations and standing, able to come together, listen to each other, forge consensus, and do it in a way that maximized the potential for agreement rather than minimizing either the potential or the outcome, right? Which is the way that a lot of times we think about it. Like, let's compromise and lower our expectations. Their approach, right, our approach as an organization was to maximize our expectations of where we could go together, right, with people across the ideological spectrum, right? Again, we had 70, 80 some odd people on our steering committee, again, across the ideological spectrum, but we, had virtual unanimity and consensus throughout the time we were leading this campaign. I think it starts with genuine curiosity. You've got to genuinely be curious about the other person and what they think and believe, what their worldview is, and why, right? How did they reach their conclusions? It's not about like, you're wrong. It's about, wow, you see things so differently than I do. How did you get there and why, right? Help me understand that. Help me understand what's really driving you, what's really important for you. I think about this a lot with immigration, which used to be an area of bipartisan, almost consensus in this country. It hasn't been for a long time. It got so polarized and politicized over the last 25 years. But I think there's enormous common ground that you could have. Safe and secure borders. That's clearly driving a lot of people on the right on immigration, right? We're not talking about the more extreme elements. There are people there who clearly want to, make sure that brown and black people don't come into the country, or they want to, get recent immigrants out of the country. But I'm talking about most people, even people on the right who are, somewhat supportive of the Trump administration. When I talk to them, what really is driving them is they're like, the border got out of control. I want a safe and secure border. Well, so do I. And so do most people on the left, right? So do people in the center. Like, okay, what does that mean? Let's talk about what that means. I know we could forge agreement for most Americans on what a safe and secure border could look like. That's not rocket science. It's just not. And I worked in immigration and spend time at the border back when I was in the Foreign Service and with the Border Patrol and going out and observing them detaining and deporting people who were trying to come across the border. I get it. Like I get what's going on there and understand the law and how it works. And I'm telling you, we forging consensus on a safe and secure border, and I think even on a sensible immigration policy, that's not rocket science, right? But we need to be able to hear each other, not just say like, you're wrong on this and you're wrong on that, but to say like, what really matters and what would that look like? And how could, like, where's that commonality? There's an enormous commonality there for most Americans, I believe. And you've got to have the discipline, again, to not only not focus on what we disagree on, but to try and find that highest common denominator, right? That commitment and discipline, right? Not just what we can tolerate, but what we can actually believe in. And again, I think immigration is a great one. I think there's a lot that most people could agree on. Not just like tolerate, right? Hold their nose, but like really agree on, right? Respect is a part of that for each other, right? I think we've lost a lot of respect for each other because we get so focused on the anger and on the extremes and who's right and who's wrong. And we can't, and it's not just about tolerance. We need to like respect each other, have real intellectual engagement with perspectives that we don't share. And again, not everybody's going to be able to do this. I get that, right? And it'd be easy to say like, oh, those people could never do that. Some of them, you're right. Whether you're on the right or the left or in the middle, you're right. Some of them can't. But some of them can, right? And the more we move in that direction, maybe more could. And I think, we need to have integrity to be honest about where agreement ends and where differences remain. It's not about like kumbaya, we're all going to agree on everything. Quite the opposite. There are times we're going to have to agree to disagree, but that shouldn't get in the way of doing things together. Look at Elizabeth Warren and Josh Hawley. Polar opposites, right? And on so many levels. But they're actually trying to push through a bipartisan bill that would kind of break up and put limitations on insurance companies. I think, like the CVS, Aetna, all that stuff, those conglomerations, the mergers. They're really trying to say, like, look, we may be ideologically opposites, but there's commonality about this system is broken, right? And we're going to try and fix it together, or at least take a step in that direction. That's awesome. We need more of that, right? So it's clearly possible, even in Washington, right? Which is so broken, but it's not completely broken. That's the thing, that we lower our expectations, right? Because we get frustrated and disillusioned. We should be raising our expectations, right? And saying, no, we got to do better than this. And when people do, some things happen, which is great, right? You've got to be willing also to be changed by what you hear. That you're not just digging in your heels and saying, I'm going to believe this no matter what for the rest of my life. That's not intellectually honest, right? And I'm not saying abandon your values, quite the opposite, but I'm saying to understand your values more clearly and the nuance behind them through contact with somebody else's values, and maybe seeing where there's actually common ground, that maybe in some ways you're not so different. It's quite possible, right? And again, I'm not talking about like compromising your values. There was a time, I'm going to share a story. I don't think I've ever told before publicly, but it's going to be in my memoir that's hopefully going to come out next year or so. And so again, Soros was funding us for the first year. We had small donations in addition, but for the most part, Soros was funding us the first year. And we were surprisingly successful right out of the gate. Everybody said we were going to fail to get Congress to pass anything meaningful on Bosnia. Congress doesn't make foreign policy, I kept getting told. And like I was an idiot, and this is by Congress people and former Congress people and lobbyists, top lobbyists, and even some journalists. And but lo and behold, I sat in the House chamber 4 months into our campaign and listened to them debate our bill and pass it, right? And the Senate passed a similar bill. Now, it all got watered down in conference committee, so that was a setback. So we weren't completely successful right away. But hey, within 4 months or so, we've got each house to basically pass our bill. So pretty awesome. It had the Clinton administration scared. So that fall, President Clinton called in George Soros and read him the Riot Act and said, you got to get those guys, Stephen Marshall, to back off. And if you don't, I'm going to make the UN withdraw their peacekeepers. And there's going to be a disaster, a humanitarian catastrophe, and it's going to be your fault, George. So George came over to our office right away from the Oval Office, and he panicked, and he's like, we got to stop. Clinton's going to pull out the UN. I have a basic calculus to do good, and I thought we were doing good, and now I'm worried that we might not be doing good, that we might bring about something bad, whatever. And I said, George, like, he's bluffing. He's not going to do that. And he's scared because we're succeeding. This is when we double down, right? Now we've got him where we want him. It got very heated. And look, Soros and I wanted the same thing. That's why he funded us, right? Because he realized that we were on the same page and we wanted to accomplish the same thing. And he trusted, our judgment and what we were trying to do. But now all of a sudden that was in question, and he was waffling. And it was the most powerful person in the world who was doing it, right? It didn't matter that Soros was his biggest donor. It was the president of the United States. When you're sitting in that Oval Office, that's pretty intimidating, right? We ended up having weeks of negotiation with Soros and his representatives about how we could move forward together. And in the end, we couldn't agree. And, you know, we weren't going to capitulate to Clinton's bluff. We knew that we were succeeding, and that given the next Congress, the next year of Congress, we could go for this legislation again and hopefully pass the exact same language in both houses and force Clinton to either veto or sign it, right? Which is what we wanted. And and we believe that everything that was happening on the ground in Congress was proving that we were right. And, in this case, Soros and we couldn't reach a common understanding, a common agreement on how to move forward, both in terms of how the organization was run and what we were advocating for. And, our credibility as a coalition with Congress, with the public, with the media, right? Everybody, with each other, with ourselves, right? Our integrity depended on everyone in the room knowing we couldn't be bought or bullied. And so Marshall and I were not willing to compromise on that. And so we parted ways, and Marshall and I ended up funding the organization. We had to lay off staff for a while, raise some money to be able to pay some of the staff, I think part-time for a bit, but we went without salaries for months. We funded the organization out of our own pockets, a lot of money, to keep it going, because we knew we were on the verge of success, or we hoped and believed we might be. And so there was a big price to pay there, but our integrity matters. So again, I'm certainly not advocating that you've got to compromise your integrity or compromise really important things in the end, like our autonomy as an organization and our agenda to get Congress to lift the arms embargo, to force the administration to either lift the embargo or intervene, was something we weren't going to compromise on. And so, at great cost, right? Certainly in the short term, but I'm very proud of the fact that our integrity held strong during that moment, right? So sometimes leadership across difference means, you have to agree to disagree. And, Soros was still, I think supportive of some of what we did. And, but, no financial or organizational, involvement after that point. But we were stronger as an organization after that, right? Even though financially we were on the verge of collapse, but organizationally, the people who stuck with us and everybody else did, and we grew our organization, actually added people to the steering committee, and to the executive committee. I think that's when Carlucci came on board. That strengthened us, right? So that was a proud moment, right? So again, sometimes leading across difference means you're going to agree to disagree, and you're going to have to part ways sometimes, and you're going to have to make sure that you know what the things are that you're not willing to sacrifice, that have to be first and foremost. Now, this can sound a lot like tooting my own horn, and I'm very proud of what we did then and what I did then. But I certainly had my moments of challenge and weakness, and that I'm not as proud of. And one of the challenges to leading across difference where I faltered a bit was, I think it was the second year, I think it was 1995. And I can't remember what the issue was, but we were having a conversation with the executive committee about something. And Mort Abramowitz, again, the legendary diplomat, he passed away not that long ago, and president of the Carnegie Endowment at the time, for a very long time. he and I got into it. We disagreed. And, you know, we had our frustrations with Mort because, he had a lot of friends in the administration and was very sympathetic to a lot of their concerns and bureaucratic limitations went on. And so sometimes we got frustrated that Mort wasn't willing to be tough enough, strong enough. He would water down our language with press releases or whatever. And so it could be frustrating. But I had enormous respect and admiration for Mort. I mean, what a legend, truly, truly, and what an impact he made on the world, in so many ways. And but and I was young. I was 32 at the time, and here I am with this diplomacy legend, and I got really frustrated with Mort. We got into it, and tempers flared a bit. And I just felt like I was frustrated with what I perceived to be his lack of resolve at times, and it got the better of me. But fortunately, cooler heads prevailed in the room, and Frank Carlucci, who had joined the executive committee, right, former defense secretary, who at the time was the head of the Carlyle Group, he stepped in, and true to his character and demeanor, calm, steady, thoughtful, but also clear and consistent in what he believed. He not only acknowledged my point, but made clear in a way that was not confrontational with Mort, or that he supported my position, but was able to do it in a way that was empathetic towards Mort and his concerns, and addressed them, eased maybe the anxiety or the angst there enough. Again, in a way that was not confrontational, that was about building fences and mending fences, not tearing them down, which was what I was a little bit doing. And Frank showed me that you can hold your conviction and lower the temperature at the same time. They're not opposites, which was really good. And to understand a bit where Mort's angst was coming from, and to try to ease it a bit, which is what I should have been doing if I was doing my job right. So, in that case, my integrity wasn't challenged because of what I believed in. It was how I expressed it and how I engaged with Mort, who I had so much respect for. So having Frank Carlucci as a role model in that regard, at least, was really important. And leading across difference means managing your own reactivity as much as requiring the understanding of the other person's, right? I mean, it's like we have to understand theirs, right? Why they disagree and why they're reactive, and Mort was reactive in that case. But then I became reactive, and that was not helpful. That you're not going to find your common ground, and you're not going to find a way to either agree on something or agree to disagree if your reactivity is getting in the way and raising the temperature and making it harder to see things clearly. And that's a really important lesson, particularly now, where I think a lot of us get very reactive. I know I do a lot of the time. And we've really got to try to manage that better, right? If we're going to listen to each other, and if we're going to maintain our own integrity throughout this, right? Our integrity isn't supported by us going off the handle or getting angry at every perceived slight or mistake or disagreement with someone else. Right? I mean, in the end, it's like, what made this coalition that we put together work? It was, people came in and throughout had their worldviews intact, right? No one was pretending anything, ever. Amazing, right? And that's part of why we were so successful. Why journalists respected us. Well, people inside the Pentagon, again, people who were, in some ways on the other side of the issue, they like were on our email distribution list, fax list. Like they were reading our stuff, asking us for opinions, coming to us for information. They trusted us and our integrity, right? Um, because we were so consistent, I think, in what we believed in, but it wasn't blinded by ideology, right, or rigidity or dogmatism, right? It was genuine, heartfelt, and intellectually honest, right? We made that commitment from the day one that we were going to be intellectually honest, that we believed that if people actually understood what was going on, they would end up agreeing with us if they were reasonable, rational people, no matter what their ideological perspective was. And that tended to be true, right? In the end, we got our legislation passed by both houses by veto-proof majorities, 2/3 of each house. That's something that never happened before or since on a major foreign policy issue. And Clinton vetoed the legislation when Congress was out of session a couple of weeks later, but he intervened because he felt like he, at that point, had to, right? That Congress had basically called him on the carpet, and he was going to be humiliated by Bob Dole, his presumed opponent for the next year running for re-election, who was the head Republican in the Senate and co-sponsor of our legislation. So, we helped trigger, right, as long as a evolution of things on the ground that got really bad. We helped trigger the intervention that ended the genocide, right? But again, that was built on the integrity and the intellectual honesty of the way that we and the executive committee and the steering committee and our grassroots activists who were vital throughout this engaged in this process, right? And again, the grassroots community similarly, across the board, lots of different perspectives and lots of different types of people and lots of different organizations, but engaged in it in for the most part in the same way that the executive and steering committees did. People listened to each other. When we had conferences of grassroots activists, people listened to each other, even when they disagreed, and treated each other, like on the executive committee, like they have something worth hearing. Think about that. Can you treat people right now on the other side ideologically like they have something worth hearing? Do you really think they have nothing worth hearing? Nothing about anything? Think about that for a minute, right? They came together, right? And this coalition looked for places where their different values converged, right? Rather than the places where they clashed. We can find plenty of ways in which we clash now. Plenty. How about finding the places where we converge? Let me give that a shot, right? When there was genuine tension, it didn't break us, right? We either tried to resolve it so we could move forward, or agreed to disagree and we could move forward, right? One of the two. Most of the time it was we found the common ground, right? And our job, for me and Marshall, in part, was to hold the container for the organization, right? And the conversations within it, and do it with integrity, so that people trusted us and trusted the process, even when they didn't fully trust each other necessarily because of shared histories, right? And I think that's huge. I think I think that's really important to understand that the process for figuring it out and that intellectual honesty that you bring to it can help you overcome the lack of trust that may have been there from before, and make some deposits in the emotional bank account for that relationship so that you can build some trust, right? And I think that's important. That's really important for us as a society right now, right? So, I'd ask you to pause for a moment and say, like, is there someone that you lead or someone that you work with or live alongside whose worldviews differ significantly than yours? I got to imagine the answer is yes. So think of a specific person, right? Not an abstraction. We can all do that, but what about a specific person? I think when we think about the abstraction, it's harder to imagine the common ground. When you think about an individual person, maybe a little bit easier. When you're in a room with them, are you genuinely curious about how they got to their conclusions? Like, not just waiting for your turn to be right and try and browbeat them or tell them they're wrong or convince them, change their mind, but just curious about how they got there, right? What are the fears, anxieties, slights, whatever they're feeling, right? Disappointments. Is there a place where your different values could actually point in the same direction? Again, I think about immigration should be an easy one for that. A highest common denominator that you just haven't found yet, right? I think they're out there. I think we can do that, right? Is there a Mordot Bromowitz in your life whose anxiety, or pace, of evolution, you've been misreading as a lack of conviction, right? Because in the end, man, Mort was with us through it all, right? And see what comes up, right? See what comes up, right? And imagine Arya Nair and G. Kirkpatrick actually did sit in the same room, listen to each other, and found common ground. That actually happened. It's not some fantasy I dreamt up, right? And it happened because they meant what they said, and they were able to hear what others meant and why, right? This polarization that we're living in isn't inevitable. God, I hope it's not, right? It's a failure largely of leadership, right? And we have been manipulated by politicians and parts of the news media, right? Distorting reality, trying to get us agitated and angry at other people, right? And look, there's a difference, I believe, between Fox News and MS Now, or whatever it's called, and CNN. Like, I do think that MS Now and CNN, for the most part, try to be intellectually honest. Fox News often is not, right? That's been my experience. So I've heard things on there where I'm like, that's actually not true. I know it's not true. But they're both trying to get people agitated so they'll watch more. They're catering to the differences. They're trying to foster fear, anxiety, anger, right? Local news does that with all the crime. It's all the bad news, right? Trying to get you agitated and get your blood pumping, because that's what's going to get you to come back again, right? Clickbait online, social media, you name it, right? What if we try to shift that in our own lives and tune out some of that stuff? The polarization doesn't have to be inevitable. At least one person at a time, it doesn't have to be, right? We need leadership, and it starts with each of us individually, taking responsibility in our own lives, our own families, our own offices, to be able to hold differences without the relationship collapsing, right? And without feeling like you have to sacrifice values that are really important to you, right? That's learnable. Starts with curiosity. Right after that, that's a superpower. It requires integrity, right? Those of you who know me know that that's number one, right? And it produces something in the end that neither side could do on its own, right? Create something new, a new understanding, a new vision, a new agreement, a new step forward that these different perspectives could actually both support, maybe, right? So maybe this week, make a commitment, have one genuine conversation with someone whose worldview differs than yours, not to change their mind and not for them to change yours, but to understand how they got there, right? Maybe we can each do that once, see what happens, right? Just be curious about it. Watch your reactivity. Don't be like me with Mort, right? But try, right? It's worth it. In the end, I think, um, you know, there are enough reasonable people in this world that have the capacity or can develop the capacity to listen to each other and hear each other and empathize and understand and find a highest common ground, right? I think we can do that, right? And thanks, Rebecca, says that's a great suggestion. Give it a try, right? I hope this was helpful. More to come. I may start wading into some of these political discussions a little bit more than I have in the past, just because I do think, maybe adding some texture to the immigration one, for instance, that it can help maybe illustrate how we can find a path forward, right? That's less divisive and more positive, more hopeful, right? We all deserve that. Thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Whether you're watching live on Substack or the replay on YouTube. And don't forget to follow me here on Substack, Integrity and Joy, and visit my website, integrityandjoy.com. And I'm elsewhere on social media and LinkedIn, and love to connect. And if you'd like to talk about how I might be of help to you or people either in my capacity as a life coach or a leadership coach, please reach out. I'd love to have that conversation with you, right? No strings attached, but lots of integrity and empathy and listening. Thanks again. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Sending everybody out there lots of love and gratitude, right? Thank you. Bye-bye.